Let's bring in Elisabeth Braw, who is a senior fellow over at the American Enterprise Institute, rather. She joins me now from London. Elisabeth, good to have you. So I know that you were listening to Dasha, and we heard from her some of the concerns and red lines from the Kremlin's perspective. I think if you were to add another red line for Moscow, that would be Ukraine's admittance into NATO. From a NATO perspective, how are they reading this? Do you think that should Moscow have any determining power as to who joins the military alliance?
No, and that has been NATO's position since its very founding, that it's open to all. Any country fulfilling the requirements for membership is welcome to apply for membership, including Russia. That's obviously highly unlikely to happen. But NATO has always said that the door is open to any prospective members. And that puts NATO in a really difficult position now, because if it continues to stress that point, which is a legitimate point, I think everybody can agree, then it's essentially saying we will keep the door open to Ukraine. And that point is something where Russia has just said, we demand that Ukraine and Georgia also, that they not be allowed to join NATO. So it's a very difficult situation for NATO at the moment.
The Kremlin is also saying that they don't want any special conditions, that they want specific guarantees. You've talked about some of them. Dasha talked about some of them. Doesn't this also put NATO in a difficult position? I mean, this could be interpreted as the Kremlin passing on an ultimatum.
Oh, it absolutely is the case that the Kremlin is presenting an ultimatum to NATO. And it's President Putin, it has to be said, is playing his hand very well, his relatively weak hand. It's Russia and a few other countries against NATO, and he's playing his hand extremely well by presenting NATO with this proposal that NATO now has to respond to. And if it responds in a way that pleases Russia, even by showing some willingness to entertain some of Russia's proposals, then it will be seen as appeasement by, for example, China, which will then be encouraged to behave aggressively towards NATO. And of course, Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states and Poland would be very concerned if NATO were to respond in a sort of conciliatory way. But if it doesn't, if it responds in a robust way and says, no, this is beyond the pale, we're not going to entertain these ideas, then Russia can use that as an excuse to escalate aggression in the region.
Okay, both U.S. President Joe Biden as well as Secretary of State Antony Blinken had said in the past that if Russia invades Ukraine, Russia would actually be facing severe consequences, both political and economical. If you read between the lines, or you don't need to read between the lines, these are sanctions. That's what we're talking about. Is this the best way to de-escalate the tensions between the two sides?
Well, realistically, if Ukraine were to be invaded, since it's not a NATO member state, other NATO member states don't have an obligation to come to its defense. And that's what makes NATO membership different from non-NATO membership. If you're invaded as a NATO member state, you can expect your fellow NATO members to come to your defense. If you're not a NATO member state, you have no such guarantees. And so it's, I think, logical that NATO doesn't want to make such promises, NATO or the United States. I think what we are more likely to see is maybe a few NATO member states coming to Ukraine's aid, but there has to be a difference between being a member and not being a member. Ukraine would like to be a member, but the reality is today it's not a member.
All right, we're just receiving some news on the wire saying from the Ukrainian presidency, Zelensky saying we are ready to meet Russia in any format. Elisabeth Braw, thank you very much for joining us here on the NewsHour.